Hello, students. I welcome you all to the part 4 of chapter 2, that is Indian economy from the period 1950 to 1990. So, here we'll discuss about India's foreign trade. Now, suppose you go to a supermarket and find Brazilian coffee or say South African bananas, you are then experiencing the effects of foreign trade. Alright, so let's begin with some basic concepts. Now, domestic production of certain goods may exceed their domestic requirement. ऐसा हो सकता है कि जितनी हमारी रिक्वायरमेंट है उससे ज़्यादा हम प्रोड्यूस कर रहे हैं, तो हम उस सरप्लस प्रोडक्शन का क्या करें. सो हम बेसिकली उस सरप्लस प्रोडक्शन को फॉरेन मार्केट्स में सेल कर देते हैं इन ऑर्डर टू अर्न profits. Alright, so a country can specialize in the production of such goods which it can produce relatively cheaper. So basically, trade between different countries of the world is called foreign trade. Alright, and it is also known as international trade. And exports refer to selling of goods and services produced in the home country to other countries. So when I'm selling my goods and services to other countries, then we call it exports. And what are imports? Imports basically means that when we are buying goods and services produced in other countries. Okay, so international trade allows countries to expand their markets for both goods and services that otherwise may not have been available domestically. Say for example, if due to differences in soil and climate, US is better at producing wheat than Brazil, whereas Brazil is better in producing coffee than US, then obviously both countries are better off when Americans can produce wheat and exchange a portion of it for some of the coffee that Brazilians produce, right? So we can basically say that exports find markets in rest of the world, while imports adds to the domestic supplies of essential goods and services. So therefore it is rightly said that foreign trade is an engine of economic growth, right? So let's now discuss India's foreign trade at the time of independence. So we all know that India has been an important trading nation since the ancient times, but the restrictive policies pursued by the colonial government adversely affected the structure, composition and volume of India's foreign trade. So as we have discussed earlier, that India became an exporter of primary products such as raw silk, wool, cotton, jute, indigo, and an importer of finished consumer goods like silk, woolen clothes, capital goods, etc. So basically, Britain maintained a monopoly control over India's export and import, right? And more than half of India's foreign trade was restricted to Britain. So this huge export surplus was used to make payments for the expenses incurred by the colonial government in Britain. So this led to the drain of Indian wealth. So as we've discussed before, where all our export surplus was not used for our development but rather for the development of Britain. But now what happened to our foreign trade after independence, right? So after independence, India's foreign trade showed a drastic change. So volume, composition and direction of trade underwent noticeable changes. So there are three words: volume, composition and direction. So let's study one by one. So the first one is the volume. So basically the volume of trade started trending up. That is, both India's export and import started to shoot up after independence. Then let's talk about the composition. So first of all, what does composition means? So the composition of trade refers to the types of goods and services we export and import. All right, so what were the changes? First of all, there was a decline in the percentage share of agricultural exports. So it was basically because, number one, India started using its farm products as raw materials for domestic production. So earlier we used to export our agriculture products, but now we see that there was a decline in the share of agricultural exports. Why? Because we were using these raw materials for our own domestic production. All right, and also there was an increase in demand of domestically produced goods. So if there is an increase in demand of our domestically produced goods, then it's natural that we would be requiring more and more of our raw materials, right? And secondly, there was a decline in percentage share of exports of conventional items like jute, tea, minerals. So basically after independence, so the domestic demands of these goods went up because of the planned development program. So earlier we used to export these commodities, but now after independence we were utilizing these conventional items in our own country. All right, the third change was that earlier we actually used to import machine made goods which were produced in England due to industrial revolution, but now we were exporting machine made goods. So it was basically because the developmental programs which were initiated by the government, they were going in the right direction. Now let's talk about the direction of trade. Now, what do I mean by direction of trade? Direction of trade refers to the countries to which a country exports its goods and services and the countries from which it imports. So, earlier we used to trade only with England, but now you see we're dealing with a lot of other countries. All right, we're dealing with US, we're dealing with China, Australia, New Zealand, European Union, etc. All right, so this is how we see that how our foreign trade has changed domestically from the time of independence to the time after independence. All right, so now let's proceed further and talk about the trade policy, which is the inward looking strategy, or in other words, import substitution. Now, in order to attain self-reliance, India followed a policy of protection. Now, the basic aim of this policy was to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. All right, so what does basically inward looking trade strategy means? So it refers to the policy of having reliance on import substitution. The name itself is suggesting its meaning, which is you have to substitute your imports. So instead of importing, you really need to produce those goods in your country itself. All right, so it basically means when you are domestically producing those goods which you were otherwise importing from other countries. All right, now how can you protect your domestic industries? You can protect it using tariffs, or you can protect it using quotas. Now, what are tariffs? Tariffs are basically tax on imported goods. All right, now which makes these imported goods more expensive, and hence they discourage imports. All right, so if I put a tax on an imported good, then obviously the price of that imported good would increase, and eventually we would say, oh, all right, this is very expensive, now I can't buy. All right, so this discourage imports. Secondly, quotas means when I specify the amount of good which can be imported. All right, I'll put up a limit that all right, this is the amount which you can import. Over and above this, you cannot import. All right, so let's come to the next topic, which is why protection was given to these domestic producers. What was the need of giving this protection to the domestic producers? Number one point is that India was not ready to compete with developing nations. So basically, developing country like India, India was not at that level to compete with those developed nations. So protection was hence required. The second point is that with protection given to domestic producers, they can learn to produce more quality products in the due course of time. So if you give protection to them, they'll learn how to produce those quality products. Otherwise, if you open up the economy, all the cheap products would enter in our economy, and obviously we would obviously buy cheap products, and hence our domestic production, our domestic producers will feel demotivated, and altogether they'll stop their production. So it was necessary to give them protection so that they can learn in due course of time that how they can produce quality products. Third point is to safeguard foreign exchange reserves and also to be self-sufficient. Obviously, if I am not importing anything from other country, I am actually saving my foreign exchange. All right, so this tends to add up to my reserves, and also I'll be more self-sufficient. I don't have to depend on other countries for importing. All right. Now, this slide is a part of industrial sector where we discuss about the role of public sector undertakings in industrial development. We discussed about IPR 1956. We discussed about small scale industries. Now we will be looking at the critical appraisal of industrial development, that is from the period 1950 to 1990. So India adopted this policy to protect its domestic industries from foreign competition. So it had positive as well as negative impact of Indian economy. So let us study them. So let's first go to the positive impact. The first one is the rise in industry's share of GDP. So eventually, because of the policies of the government, we found that there was a rise in the share of industry towards GDP. So what we were witnessing was the structural transformation, as we have discussed in our previous videos, that when an economy develops, the share of agriculture sector goes down, whereas the share of industry and services sector goes up. So this was what we were observing, that we could see that the share of industry was rising up, which shows that our country was witnessing structural transformation. All right, the next point is diversification of industrial sector. Now our industrial sector became very well diversified by 1990s. We were not only confined to the production of basic goods like cotton, jute, etc., but rather we were producing a variety of products. All right, so the protection from foreign competition enabled the development of indigenous industries also, mainly in the areas of electronics and automobile sector, which otherwise would not have been developed. So all this could be possible only because of the policy of protection. The third one is promotion of small scale industries. We've discussed a lot about small scale industries in our previous videos, where we understood that the main motive was to promote equity and to provide more employment opportunities. So basically, the promotion of small scale industries gave opportunities to those people who do not have the capital to start, to start their business. So this encouraged actually small investors to invest and to earn returns on their investments, and also they were developed to achieve the objectives of employment and equity, as we have discussed before. All right, now the fourth point is promotion of domestic production. Now domestic industries were basically protected from foreign competition, and this was done in order to promote the growth of domestic industry. So if you're protecting our domestic industries from foreign competition, then obviously my domestic production would increase, and which implies that I will actually, so which actually promotes the growth of domestic industry. All right, so now let's come to the negative impact, which is, the first one is inefficient public monopolies. So PSUs started turning into monopolies, public sector undertakings. So as an example, let's take an example of telecommunication service, so which could even be provided by the private sector. All right, but then too it was given to the public sector. So as a result, one had to wait for a long time to get a telephone connection, right? But now what you do, now you get repeated SMS offering you a new telephone connection free of charge. All right, so even private sector could not even manufacture bread at that time. This was also given to the public sector. So it actually created inefficient public monopolies. The second point is lack of competition implied lack of modernization. Now, since the domestic producers were protected from the foreign competition, they had no incentive to improve the quality of the product, and they were able to sell low quality products at a higher price due to the absence of competition. Obviously, if there is no competition, all right, if there's no competition, then I will have no incentive to innovate, and I will make no efforts to modernize, because I know that everybody will buy my product only, so why to innovate, why to unnecessarily waste time? But on the other hand, if there is competition and I know there is my competitor, and I have to make an edge, I have to innovate, so that people should not go to my competitor, but then people should come to me to purchase my products. All right, so competition from imports forces producers to be more efficient. The third point is concentration of power in public sector's hand. So actually there was no clear demarcation, as to what public sector alone can do and what private sector alone can do. For example, even the private sector can hold the responsibility of handling hotels, yet the government also runs the hotel. All right, so the government could focus only on important services which the private sector could not provide. So there should be a clear demarcation, like, all right, these are the important areas which government should control, and these are not so important areas where private sector could be given the responsibility. All right, now the fourth one is difficulty to close unviable government enterprises. This basically means that many PSUs, even after incurring huge losses, continue to operate, since it is difficult to close a government undertaking, even if it is a drain on nations' limited resources. The reason is that government sector is unlike private sector, which works for profit making, that. So government basically works for social welfare, and if you suddenly shut down an PSU, there'll be a massive unemployment, so you cannot immediately shut down a PSU. All right, so that's the point. And the last one is misuse of licensing policy. So we all know there was a license raj, where we really need to have a license to start a new industry or set up an industrial unit. So basically more time was spent by the industrialist in trying to obtain license, rather than thinking on how to improve their product. And big industrialists would get a license not only for starting a new firm, but also to prevent competitors from starting new firms. So basically big industrialists had a lot of money. All right, so so a lot of lobbying was done. Okay, give me you I'll give you this amount of money, you please give me this license, and don't give the license to this X person. All right, so this kind of lobbying was done. And if you do such kind of lobbying, you're the only one who's producing that commodity, you are the monopoly there, and as a result you can charge whichever price you want to, because there are no competitors. आपका कोई competitor ही नहीं है, because you're the only one who is actually producing that commodity. So this was basically done so that they can keep their monopoly in the market, number one, and as a result, number two, they could charge high price for their product, all right, due to lack of competition from other firms. So in the end, I would say that owing to all these problems, economists called for a change in our policy, and hence it led the government to introduce new economic policy in 1991. Now, what was this new economic policy? That we will discuss in subsequent chapters. Thank you.